Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Ooh. Introduction of guests. Recognize the member for Indian Head, Milestone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you to the rest of the chamber, I'd like to introduce a young entrepreneur who's visiting the Assembly today. Miguel Catelier is in the gallery, and also joining Miguel is Derek Robinson. For many on this side certainly have a pretty good idea of the great work that Derek does for sure with us. But Miguel was recently recognized by CBC as the 2018 Future 40 winner, Mr. Speaker. Miguel is the founder of two different companies, True Green Metal Recycling and True Green Energy, based out of Emerald Park. I'm going to have much more to say about Miguel and the companies that he has in member statements, but right now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like all members to join me in welcoming both Miguel and Derek to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to join briefly with the member to introduce these very impressive young entrepreneurs to their assembly. Michael and Derek, thank you so much for being here today. And it's really, both of these are impressive entrepreneurs. It was interesting. I learned more about Michael here recently, and it's really an amazing company that you've been growing. So the future looks bright with entrepreneurs like this in our province, and on behalf of the official opposition, we offer a warm welcome.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with great pleasure I introduce three individuals in your gallery. Family members, in fact. One of them actually gave birth to me about 55 years ago. My mom, Pat, is up in the Assembly. Pat Ottenbright currently resides in Regina as well. Two of my cousins, Denise Exner and Celine Ottenbright, formerly of Grayson and now residing in Regina as well. So I ask all members to welcome my family members to their Legislative Assembly.
Here, here. As the Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Up in the far gallery today, we have some students from one of the schools of my constituency, Ecole Massey. We have 26 grade 6 and 7 students, Mr. Speaker. They're accompanied by their teacher, Cassie Clement. I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you following question period today for a picture and really, I'm sure, what will be an engaging discussion. Can everyone join me in welcoming these students to their Legislative Assembly?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister responsible for advanced education in welcoming these students, but in particular, one of them is Graydon McGovern, who is attending the proceedings for the first time with his teacher, Madam Clement. He enjoys science and history, baseball, swimming, and this year has started playing the bassoon in the band. But more significantly, Mr. Speaker, he is the son of Darcy McGovern, who is one of the Ministry of Justice lawyers and has done a remarkable job for many years in preparing documents and everything else, and is somebody that I think is regarded as competent professional, as are many of the people, all of the people working in our civil service. So I would like to use this as an opportunity to thank all of our civil servants and to recognize Graydon and welcome him to his legislature today.
Here, here. Recognize the member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and to all members of the legislature, I'd like to introduce a dozen grade 5 and 6 students from École des Charmes in Moose Jaw today, our French school. They did ask me a couple of questions in French that I struggled through, but we made do. Along with their teacher, Madame Marie Chantal Poulin, as well as Miss Nicole Cochran, who happens to be the Minister of Social Services' wife's cousin. So I'd like to welcome them to their legislature.
Presenting petitions. Oh, okay. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the job-killing, Trudeau-pushing carbon tax that will cost every producer, agriculture producer, every businessman, and every individual in this province money. I will read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. This petition is signed by the good citizens from the town of Davidson and Bladworth. I so present.
Here, here.
Recognized the member for John Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present a petition on behalf of concerned residents, businesses all across our province as it relates to the hike and the expansion of the PST onto construction labor. This quite simply is the epitome of a job-killing tax at a time where we need nothing more than jobs and investment, Mr. Speaker. It's devastated businesses across our province. We see permits down all across our province, and it's forced job loss impacting so many and forced many to leave our province, Mr. Speaker. And the prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions are signed by concerned residents from Regina and Yorkton. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition calling for a public inquiry into the GTH land deal. The people who signed this petition wish to bring to our attention the following. The Sask Party has refused to come clean on the GTH land deal, a deal where Sask Party insiders made millions flipping land and taxpayers lost millions. The Sask Party continues to block key witnesses from providing testimony about the land deal, and it is Saskatchewan people who footed the bill for the GTH land deal and deserve nothing less than the truth. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to stop hiding behind partisan excuses and immediately call for a judicial inquiry and a forensic audit into the GTH land deal. And Mr. Speaker, the individuals who have signed this petition today are from the good city of Moose Jaw. I so present.
Here, 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 here.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the concerned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to your attention the following. That Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside Saskatchewan, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. Wow. And we know that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But, Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, the Sask Party has collected $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, these people believe that Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people, and that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, and British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from Fort Capel, Saskatoon, and Cowessess. I do so present. Thank you.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for pharmacare for Saskatchewan. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that Canada is the only country with a universal healthcare system that doesn't include prescription drug coverage, and this oversight results in unnecessary illness and suffering and costs us billions. That over 90% of Canadians agree that we need a national pharmacare program, which makes sense as 1 in 5 Canadians don't fill necessary prescriptions because the medication costs too much. And when we cover essential medications, we improve people's quality of life and save millions in downstream costs. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Saskatchewan Party government to immediately support the establishment of universal pharmacare for Saskatchewan people and advocate for national pharmacare for all Canadians. People signing this petition come from Moose Jaw, Mr. Speaker. I do so present.
Recognize the member for Regina, Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition calling for a restoration of public control over Wascana Park. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners point out that Wascana Park is a treasured urban park and conservation area that had been responsibly managed through an equitable partnership between the City of Regina, the provincial government, and the University of Regina for more than 50 years until the province unilaterally gave itself majority control of the board of the Provincial Capital Commission through the changes brought on by Bill 50, the Provincial Capital Commission Act in 2017. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of people concerned about the well-being of the park. They want the Sask Party government to get their mitts off the park. And in the prayer that reads as follows, the petitioners respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to restore the governance structure of the Wascana Centre Authority and end the commercialization of Wascana Park. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by good citizens in the fair City of Regina. I so present.
Hear, hear.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to rise today to recognize the team at North Sask Law in North Battleford. At the recent National Pro Bono Conference in Vancouver, BC, North Sask Law of North Battleford won the Canadian National Pro Bono Firm Award. This award recognizes a Canadian law firm that has made an outstanding contribution to the provision of pro bono services. North Sask Law was able to beat out some steep competition against many law firms across Canada and internationally. North Sask Law is made up of 3 lawyers, owner Richard Gibbons, Robert Feist, and Benedict Feist. Since 2015, North Sask Law has dedicated a large portion of their lawyers' time and attention to participate in the North Battleford Free Legal Clinic and provide additional time to take on full representation of files. North Sask Law currently makes up approximately 80% of the volunteer pool in the North Battleford area. The team at North Sask Law has shown itself to be a crucial part in creating a more accessible justice system in North Battleford and surrounding area. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating North Sask Law for their commitment to improving access to justice in Saskatchewan.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House today to bring awareness to Unite to End Violence Against Women and Girls Orange campaign and our government's continued support of such a great cause. This year, Mr. Speaker, the campaign begins November 25th. This campaign will span 16 days and it will conclude on December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day. The orange color has been chosen for this campaign, meant to symbolize a bright future. Everyone is encouraged to wear something orange throughout the 16 days of this campaign. Business and Professional Women Saskatoon has partnered with Grandmothers Advocacy Network in Saskatoon to start a conversation and to shine a spotlight on the struggles of women and children affected by violence and abuse, both locally and internationally. Mr. Speaker, violence and abuse against anyone is appalling and needs to be addressed. This campaign has started that much-needed conversation. I encourage all members to show support for such a meaningful and well-worth campaign. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate the Saskatoon and Indian and Métis Friendship Centre on its 50th anniversary. Celebrations were held this past Thursday, and I was pleased to be able to attend the evening program. The Friendship Centre has had a long and successful history of working with and for Métis and First Nations citizens of Saskatoon. They provide recreational, cultural programming, and social services for people of all ages. Colleen Whitedeer, the SMIFC chair, remarked whether it was access to a telephone, a hot meal, or learning how to dance traditional powwow, we have made a difference and will continue to do so. Sandra Young, Chief Executive Director, said, "The centre has come a long way since it first opened its doors in 1968, and we are proud of the journey." Senator Elder Nora Cummings, the only surviving member from the early days, was present, as well as May Henderson, longtime Executive Director. Both helped so much along the way. A beautiful wall mural and the naming of the Paul Koo Gymnasium was a highlight of the evening in recognition of Paul Koo, an employee of nearly 40 years. Mr. Speaker, in marking the Friendship Centre's 50th anniversary, 50 painted lady butterflies were released by children and elders in Saskatoon's Reconciliation Park on National Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join with me in congratulating the Saskatoon Indian and Métis Friendship Centre on reaching this remarkable milestone of 50 years of service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize a member for Indian Head milestone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to have such a young and driven entrepreneur here in the Legislative Assembly today. Miguel Catelier is only 29 years old and has accomplished so much already in his young life. From a young age, Miguel was ambitious and always knew he wanted to create something new. So he set out to teach himself all the ins and outs of business by reading hundreds of books on business. Miguel started his business venture in the networking market world, and by the age of 25, he had founded True Green Metal Recycling. True Green Metal Recycling is a mobile metal recycling company which focuses primarily on cleaning up industrial metal recycling projects as well as obsolete farm equipment. In 2015, Miguel's company since 2015, the company has recycled over 200 million pounds of steel product in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. But Miguel didn't stop there. He also was the founder of True Green Energy, a full-service solar energy engineering, procurement, and construction company serving the people of Saskatchewan. Not only did Miguel's company put millions of dollars back into Saskatchewan's economy every year, but they also provide around 40 full-time jobs for Saskatchewan people. It's incredible the contribution that Miguel has made to this province already, and that's why he was recognized by CBC's Saskatchewan as the 2018 Fortune 40 winner. Miguel's story reflects the great entrepreneurial spirit here in this province. We are lucky to have him here. Thank you.
As a member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to stand to announce that our government has proclaimed this week as Saskatchewan Manufacturing Week. This proclaimed week provides the opportunity to highlight the economic significance of the sector to Saskatchewan and to showcase the success achieved by businesses and communities. Manufacturing plays a key role in Saskatchewan, making up 7% of the provincial GDP. Our manufacturing shipments have increased by 54% between 2007 and 2017, totaling $16 billion last year alone. The sector employs about 28,000 people who work across the province, manufacturing products from the agriculture, oil and gas, mining and technology sectors. Saskatchewan manufacturers have achieved many world firsts in everything from satellite communications technology and dryland farming equipment to inroad scales for the trucking industry. Mr. Speaker, our government continues to support this sector through initiatives that offer competitive advantages, such as a corporate income tax as low as 10% on manufacturing and processing exporter and processing profits, the Saskatchewan Commercial Innovation Incentive, which is the first patent box style incentive of its kind in North America, manufacturing and processing exporter hiring tax incentives, and provincial tax exemptions for eligible machinery, equipment, and materials. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in recognizing Saskatchewan Manufacturing Week. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, communities across the province came together to celebrate the 2018 Saskatchewan Film Week, which was held from November 17th to the 23rd. It was a great chance to celebrate the industry as well as provide an opportunity for learning, exploration, and personal development. This year's Saskatchewan Film Week was hosted by the Saskatchewan Media Production Industry Association in collaboration with other Saskatchewan-based film and art associations. The celebrations kicked off with industry workshops which were held in Saskatoon and Regina throughout the week. This was an excellent opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to showcase the industry that contributes so greatly to the culture in our province. I'd like to recognize a few of the winners who took home hardware from the Saskatchewan Independent Film Awards held by the Saskatchewan Film Pool Cooperative on Friday night, including Beta Test, a film by Joel Maker and Kenton Evanson, and Supergrid, directed by Lowell Dean, which took home Best Feature Film. The Government of Saskatchewan is proud to support the film pool through funding from the Saskatchewan Arts Board and Sask Culture. I'd like to recognize and thank everybody involved in planning this year's Film Week, as well as congratulate Friday night's winners on their accomplishments and recognitions. Because of your hard work, the film community has an exciting week with lots of events to look forward to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member from Moose Jaw, welcome up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, I attended a launch event for a new police and crisis team in my home community of Moose Jaw, along with the Minister of Corrections and Policing. Mr. Speaker, Police and Crisis Team, or PACs, pair mental health workers with police officers so they can better respond to people in mental health crisis situations. The goal is to diffuse these situations, avoiding emergency room visits, as well as entry into the criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, we have already seen great success with PACs in Saskatoon and Regina. From April 2017 to September 2018, the Saskatoon team responded to 1,183 calls, 287 of which avoided an emergency department visit. Over the same period, the Regina team responded to 1,039 calls, 261 of which avoided an emergency department visit. Mr. Speaker, bringing this innovative approach to Moose Jaw wouldn't be possible without the hard work and dedication of the Moose Jaw Police Service and the Saskatchewan Health Authority. The Moose Jaw Police and Crisis Team has already responded to 35 calls in its first 15 working days. I would like to say a special thank you to the Moose Jaw team for everything they're doing in my hometown, keeping us safe while caring for our most vulnerable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When a problem arises, a responsible leader takes ownership and gets to the bottom of the issue. When it comes to how this government is responding to the vendor-sponsored travel scandal, we get evasion and a different answer every time we ask. And while they stop pretending it's just fine or that it never happens, this government's new line just won't cut it. The Premier is only committed to releasing what travel was, and I quote, in violation of the government policy. That kind of careful language is all about hiding behind ambiguous choices of words. It's about avoiding responsibility. It's about a review designed to find what we've heard so many times from this government. No conflict of interest, no wrongdoing, not rampant, not criminal in nature. Nothing to see here because we didn't look. Will the Sask Party stop averting its eyes and commit to reviewing and releasing the full list of vendor-sponsored travel across all crowns, ministries, and agencies?
I recognize the Deputy Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we made it painfully clear, Mr. Speaker, that the Deputy Minister to the Premier will be conducting a review on vendor-sponsored travel across executive government, Mr. Speaker, and he'll report back on vendor-sponsored travel, and to the extent that that violates the policy of the government, Mr. Speaker, then that will be reported, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to prejudge the work that the Deputy to the Premier is doing, Mr. Speaker. It will certainly inform the next steps of this government, Mr. Speaker, but we're going to let him do his work. Right. And once that work is done, Mr. Speaker, we're happy to report back. Right.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's worth noting that the Sask Party members weren't always satisfied with the notion that an investigation by the Premier's Deputy Minister into government mismanagement would be sufficient. A 2003 article from the Star Phoenix quoted Brad Wall, saying, Brad Wall said a judge should be appointed to head up the probe. He said it's not appropriate for the Premier's office to investigate. The Sask Party complained then. They complained then that a more independent review was needed, but ironically, they now think that level of oversight is just fine, Mr. Speaker. It's like the member for Martensville Warman asking about the perils of vendor-sponsored travel at SLGA years ago, but now, being part of a government that's not willing to get to the bottom of what's really happening. Mr. Speaker, to be clear, just to be clear, we don't mind the Deputy Minister looking into this. What we do mind is the idea that he would be the one who judges the validity of the question. That, Mr. Speaker, is up to a fully informed public, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, because by determining the scope of this investigation, this government is determining the answer. And so I'm asking the Deputy Premier if he will make it clear that the scope of this includes reviewing and releasing all vendor-sponsored travel, not just that which this government deems was not okay.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Deputy Premier.
The deputy to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is the head of the Public Service. I can't think of a better individual, Mr. Speaker, to do the review on whether or not there's been any violations of policy by members of the Public Service, Mr. Speaker. These are dedicated individuals, Mr. Speaker, individuals who have great respect for the rules, Mr. Speaker, and in the off chance, Mr. Speaker, that there's a violation, and we've seen this, Mr. Speaker, there's significant consequences to flow to anyone that violates that policy, Mr. Speaker. We have full faith and confidence in the Deputy to the Premier to do the investigation as the head of the Public Service, Mr. Speaker, and we'll look forward to his report. We're not going to prejudge it, as I've said, Mr. Speaker, but we're going to wait for his report, and that report, to the extent that there's any violations of policy, Mr. Speaker, that will inform the next decisions that the government needs to make.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to clarify that investigation or those questions about SLGI were from the previous member for Martensville-Warman, and I apologize for any lack of clarity there. Mr. Speaker, last week we heard from the Minister of Social Services that, quote, any concern from poverty is real within Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, his recognition that people are struggling, and struggling in a time that our economy is struggling, is a remarkable and refreshing departure from the usual line of a government that doubles down on denials and distractions, that refuses to admit that everything is not just fine in our economy. This government has doubled our debt, doubled the PST, all while Alberta's economy grows at double the pace. Mr. Speaker, the austerity approach of this government has left Saskatchewan people with fewer services, higher costs, and a sluggish economy. Will the Premier join the Social Services Minister, admit that his government is failing Saskatchewan people in need, and tell us the plan to correct the course for our economy?
I recognize the Minister of Trade.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has been very reluctant lately to talk about the economy, and I think I know why, Mr. Speaker. The last jobs report showed 9,400 jobs created in this province, Mr. Speaker, the largest job gain since 2014. We have the urban housing starts increased by 19.4% in October 2018, ranking second in growth in the entire country, Mr. Speaker. In September 2018, wholesale trade increased by over 11.4%, second in percentage terms amongst the provinces. In September 2018, the value of building permits in Saskatchewan increased 19.6%, third amongst the provinces, Mr. Speaker. And I can also tell you how this province will continue to move forward. That will be with a pipeline being constructed, Mr. Speaker, a carbon tax not being imposed on this province. We would encourage the members opposite to support a pipeline being built. They will refuse to do so, Mr. Speaker, and also to say no to Justin Trudeau's carbon tax rather than being his biggest cheerleader.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Facts are facts. Statistics Canada shows that our province's GDP growth is the worst outside Atlantic Canada. Alongside our growing debt, that poses a risk to our future growth, and it poses real risks to our people. It has resulted already in rising social costs, Mr. Speaker. More children are being apprehended, more people are living in poverty, and the minister boasts about spending more.
Sorry, I'm having a difficult time hearing, but recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, more children are being apprehended, more people are living in poverty, and the minister boasts about spending more on income supports than ever before. We know that the best way for people to leave poverty is to enter the workforce. But with our rock bottom minimum wage, people find themselves facing a terrible decision, having to decide between scraping by on social assistance or scraping by on poverty wages. This makes life harder for those in need and costs us all more in health, in justice, and in social services. My question, Mr. Speaker, do the so-called fiscal conservatives across the aisle actually prefer that people stay on social assistance rather than being able to work for a living, or will they step up and support our bill to phase in a $15 minimum wage?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Mr. Speaker, we know what their policy would do, which is kill jobs. We know what their record on jobs is, Mr. Speaker, which was the worst in the country, Mr. Speaker. We also know what our record is on jobs, the second best rate of job creation in the entirety of Canada over the course of the last decade. The #1 job rate growth over the course of the last month since 2014, 9,400 jobs created. I actually agree with the member opposite that the best way for those to move forward economically is by engaging in the labour market. And we've been tremendously successful on this side of the House over the course of the last decade and recently, Mr. Speaker. And that member wants to talk about the economy. Mr. Speaker, that member has no credibility on the economy, zero. And his own party supporters know it, Mr. Speaker, half of whom would vote who think that this side of the House does a better job in managing the economy than they would. We also know of their tiny handful of economic policies that they put in the window. What are those, Mr. Speaker? Raise royalties, chase out companies, Mr. Speaker, that are creating jobs in this province, support a carbon tax, oppose pipelines. That is the wrong prescription for this province, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that Bill Boyd and Lori Pusher didn't do their homework when they were closing the deal for the east parcels at the GTH. It turns out that that land was an even worse deal than we previously thought. And they weren't the only ones who didn't do their homework. Last week, I asked the minister about a new report from a forensic appraiser that notes 14 acres of the east parcel's land cannot be developed because pipelines are under the surface, and the minister told this House, quote, "There is nothing new with that article." Well, minutes later, the minister told reporters he hadn't even read the report. So here's the Coles notes, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan people seem to be on the hook for $1.4 million for several acres on the east parcels that can't be developed and that no one in their right mind would buy. So is the minister now up to speed? Exactly how much land at the GTH cannot be developed, and can he explain why the Sask party paid $103,000 per acre for that land that no one can develop?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the members opposite, our province is in the energy business. We have pipelines going throughout the province in a number of different places. Mr. Speaker, the pipelines that they're referring to are on all the maps. Anybody that looks at the maps, they see the lines going across. Anybody that's a developer would certainly look at that, Mr. Speaker. There are, in fact, 4 pipelines running through the East Lands described. 2 of them are Kinder Morgan pipelines. One is the Spectra Energy pipeline, which runs parallel and diagonal from the northwest, and the remaining pipeline is owned by Transgas, and runs from northwest to southeast. Mr. Speaker, there are pipelines running underneath land all across the province. Mr. Speaker, there are setbacks, there are buffer zones. Mr. Speaker, appraisals have been done. People have looked at the land since, and that has never been an issue. It's shown on all the maps, even on the maps that were used and are on the CBC website when they're talking about Brighton View, Mr. Speaker. That's what the business of our province is energy.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Without even having read the report, the minister tried to sweep the findings under the rug. But here's the thing. The auditor did not canvass the fact that 14 acres of those east parcels were unusable, as the minister has suggested. These findings have a direct impact on public dollars. You can graze cattle or grow canola over top of pipelines, but the GTH minister might have trouble convincing anyone to purchase those 14 acres to build a mega mall or an imaginary head office for Bradcorp. This government is bending over backwards to deny Saskatchewan people the answers they deserve. Considering new details emerge every week and the minister himself doesn't appear to know what is going on, will this government finally, today, call a judicial inquiry into the land acquisition at the GTH?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we have municipal reserve, we have setbacks, there are a variety of different ways that people work in and around pipelines. Right. It's part of our province's history. And Mr. Speaker, I've got an example.
We got railroads too.
White City, which is just to the east of Regina, has got in fact 5 Enbridge pipelines that deliver varying amounts underneath it. Yep. Mr. Speaker, those pipelines deliver on a daily basis, have a maximum capacity of 2 million barrels per day. That's what goes under White City, and we don't see the mayor of White City or anybody else from White City coming and saying, we can't live here, we can't build here, we can't develop. You can build roads, you can build parking lots, there's a variety of things you can do on top of them. You may not build a building under it, you build a building next to it, Mr. Speaker. That's how things are done. A large development such as there is at GTH is bound to have some pipelines underneath it. No surprise here, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
On Thursday, I received a letter from the Minister of Education that asked me to share with him information that I was given regarding the ministry's behind closed doors library engagement panel. Now, I appreciate irony, Mr. Speaker, as much as anyone else, and I know that the best way to model good behavior, or to promote good behavior, is to model it, so I gladly did so. But, Mr. Speaker, I think that it's only fair that the minister does the same. Will the minister share with the public the questions that the library engagement panel is asking? And since not one, but 2 sets of minutes are being taken at these meetings with stakeholders, will the minister commit to sharing those minutes with the public?
Sure. I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, last week in question period, Mr. Speaker, the member asked me a question attributing to the panel work that's being done by the Legislative Secretary, the member from Kenora-Pelly, with regard to committing to head office, maintaining head offices, Mr. Speaker, with respect within the library system, Mr. Speaker. Now, she well knows I sent her a letter, Mr. Speaker, advising her that that was not a question, notwithstanding the fact that she attributed it to us, Mr. Speaker. That was not a question that we were asking, Mr. Speaker. There are certainly minutes being taken of these meetings, Mr. Speaker. Those minutes are going to form the basis of the report, the public report, which we will table with this legislature once all that work is done, Mr. Speaker. But it would be premature to to table those minutes at this point in time, Mr. Speaker. They will form part of a final report, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to what the member has asked, Mr. Speaker, there will be public consultation with respect to the work that's being done by the committee. We want to be transparent about this. We understand the importance of the library system. We'll continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to have our engagements. The report will be made public, and there will be public consultation.
As a member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, in his letter of last Thursday, the minister asserted that the Public Library Engagement Panel had not asked participants to comment on the possible closure of headquarters and was not, in fact, using a survey. The minister has now had several days to review the documents that I provided to him, including the headquarter questions and a survey attributed to the Public Library Engagement Panel. So if there's confusion, Mr. Speaker, about who said what and when, there's a simple solution. Get this process out from behind closed doors and show your work. Again, will the minister table the questions being asked, commit to making public the meeting minutes, and also make public all submissions to this panel?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I've already said, Mr. Speaker, the minutes will form the basis of the report that's being prepared, Mr. Speaker. It would be premature to release those minutes now, Mr. Speaker. I've confirmed with the member opposite that the survey questions that were asked were not from our committee, Mr. Speaker. They were from a third party, Mr. Speaker, who has been participating in this, but I'm not going to take credit for those questions, Mr. Speaker. We're having an open conversation with respect to the future of libraries in Saskatchewan. We've committed to doing this work, Mr. Speaker. There will be public consultation, Mr. Speaker. I invite the member and the members opposite to provide Mr. Speaker, I invite them to provide their comments with respect to their views with respect to the future of public libraries in this province, Mr. Speaker. Everybody's opinion is important, Mr. Speaker, and it will form the basis of the public report. Well, Mr. Speaker, they don't want to hear the answer. They don't, because it doesn't fit their narrative, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't fit their narrative, Mr. Speaker. The work that we're doing in terms of engaging with participants, with stakeholders in the library system, Mr. Speaker, is fully public, Mr. Speaker. They can participate if they want, Mr. Speaker, but the report will be made public after public consultation.
Recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The community of Fond du Lac is one of the many communities suffering from the neglect of this government. Fond du Lac needs upgrades to its northern airport, and this government has done nothing about it for over a year since a very tragic plane crash. Leaders of the community have been constantly raising their concerns for urgently needed upgrades to handle the size of aircraft landing on their sites, and more so to ensure the safety of their community members, but this government has simply ignored their demands. These upgrades are needed, and the community members shouldn't be made to wait years for federal dollars that might not even come. When will this government commit to the necessary upgrades that are desperately needed at the Fond du Lac Airport?
I recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. Firstly, my condolences go out to the family of the young man who tragically lost his life in that plane crash last year. As always, our thoughts and prayers go out to the family members, passengers, and the community that experienced this incident. This airport is a vital part of the community of Fond du Lac and we are committed to maintaining this facility and its current service level, which is similar to upgrades that were recently done at other airports. We currently have an application in to the federal government, Mr. Speaker, regarding the upgrading of this runway. These improvements would make the Fond du Lac runway similar in size to Buffalo Narrows, Meadow Lake, and Hudson Bay. This would be a great benefit to that community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Mr. Speaker, there is significant difference between maintenance and upgrades, Mr. Speaker. This community has been through enough. We've had the tragic plane accident, and we ensure the government hears the message that we don't need tragic accidents in Fond du Lac to ever occur again. This community also suffers with kids taking their lives because they have no hope left. Any substantial support towards this community would be very much appreciated, Mr. Speaker. If this government can spend on mega projects like the GTH and the carbon capture project without blinking an eye, it should be able to invest in infrastructure that is vital to the life of this community. Mr. Speaker, people put their lives at risk each and every day when they board these aircrafts. So again, my question to the minister, park the maintenance argument. We need improvements. We need upgrades. When is Fond du Lac going to see a portion of this government's lavish expenditures extended to them?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again I thank the member opposite for the question. Mr. Speaker, I would like to make it clear. We are investing in the north. This past fiscal year, we're investing in those northern transportation systems over $61 million. As I've already mentioned, we currently have an application into the federal government to partner on Fond du Lac Airport, and we have been working actively with the communities that are there to try and advance this project. I was speaking with my Assistant Deputy Minister earlier today, and he informed me that he has inquired Actually, he spoke with them this morning, and he has inquired about this, and he's looking for a status on the application. So we're not letting this lie. We're actually looking to see where this sits on their plate also. And let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, since 2006-07, we have increased funding to Northern Transportation System by 97%. I would call that investing in the North. Thank you.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, we learned last week that one of the few options for expectant mothers in Saskatchewan's northeast is to travel to Prince Albert for deliveries. But we know this is not only a burden to pregnant women, but it will also put a pressure on already strained department in the Prince Albert Hospital. Doctors have been sounding the alarm about capacity pressures in the Victoria Hospital neonatal unit, comparing the tiny 375 square foot NICU to a telephone booth. They say the space hasn't grown in 16 years, despite more deliveries to support rapid growth in our northern communities. We know there's a fundraiser ongoing, but physicians, mothers, and sick babies shouldn't have to wait up to 3 years for a safe and appropriate unit. What is this government's plan to add capacity to the neonatal unit in PA?
You're here. I recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Officials from the Saskatchewan Health Authority and the Ministry of Health have been in constant contact with members from the Prince Albert Victoria Hospital. We know that there are pressures and struggles there, but we've been assured that they can deliver the services that are needed for the time being. That in consultation with the individuals from Flin Flon and area Creighton that are currently under a little bit of a struggle with their obstetrics department, Mr. Speaker. We know that the issues in Flin Flon are not a cutback. They're an issue that's derived directly from a difficulty in attracting and retraining professionals, Mr. Speaker. We know that those services have been interrupted from time to time in the past. Professionals from the Manitoba Health Authority and Saskatchewan Health Authority didn't feel confident in delivering those services for the meantime in a safe manner. Our #1 priority is, of course, to keep the mothers in the area for those services if possible. If not, Mr. Speaker, our priority is to make sure that they have safe delivery of their children and safe care for the mothers.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, these conversations only go so far. This unit only has gas to support 4 babies, even though there is consistently between 11 and 8 premature babies in the unit at one time. It's a recipe for disaster and one that needs fixing immediately. The provincial head of the Department of Pediatrics knows this, telling media last week that nurses and physicians are, quote, in desperate need of a better space, adding, quote, these babies have the need right now, end quote. The mantra of this government is to focus on core services of government, but what is more core to government operations than properly supporting the care of sick and premature infants? Does the minister agree with those on the front lines and in pediatrics that the need is now, not when finances permit or when fundraising goals are met? And will he commit to fully funding an expansion today?
Hear, 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 hear. I recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Victoria Hospital Foundation identified this as a priority some time ago, and we agree that this is a priority, and we appreciate the work they've done to make it happen up to this point. We understand that their plan is to expand from the existing 4-bed level 2 care unit to a 10-bed space with private facilities and spaces for family and new upgraded equipment. As committed by our Premier, and I know other individuals on this side of the House, my fellow minister, that we will 100% fund any upgrades to the facility, including the new Prince Albert Victoria Hospital, when that plan is finalized and comes to fruition, Mr. Speaker. Hear, hear, hear.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Wine.
I recognize the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 157, the Education Amendment Act 2018, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Minister of Education that Bill number 157 be now introduced and read a first time. It's a pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number 2, the Honourable Ms. Tell.
I recognize the Government House Leader.
58, the Youth Justice Administration Act 2018, now be introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Government House Leader that Bill number 158 be now introduced and read a first time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Government House Leader.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Second readings. Item number 1, Bill number 153, the Saskatchewan Employment Leaves Amendment Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to move second reading of Bill 153, the Saskatchewan Employment Leaves Amendment Act 2018. As stated in the throne speech, this bill creates new leaves as well as increases the length of existing leaves based on recent changes to the Federal Employment Insurance Act. We are introducing a new critically ill adult leave to enable employees to take up to 17 weeks of leave in a year for a critically ill or injured family member. Parental leave is being expanded from 34 weeks to 59 weeks if the mother takes both the maximum maternity and parental leave. If the partner is taking parental leave, it increases from 37 to 63 weeks. This changes to ensure that new parents have job protection while accessing employment insurance benefits. I am also pleased to say that this bill increases maternity and adoption leaves from 18 to 19 weeks. With this change, Saskatchewan leads all jurisdictions in Canada. Changes have been made to the maternity leave provisions to enable employees to start maternity leave a week earlier, 13 weeks before their due date instead of 12 weeks. Mr. Speaker, these changes to parental and critically ill family leaves align our leave position with benefits available through employment insurance, allowing workers in Saskatchewan to fully access those benefits. Finally, we have expanded interpersonal violence leave to include sexual violence committed by any person, regardless of whether or not the survivor had a relationship with that person. Mr. Speaker, all of us in the House are aware of the high rates of interpersonal violence in Saskatchewan. We recognize that much more work is needed to address this issue. In the meantime, we hope that expanding on interpersonal violence leave and introducing Clare's Law will provide much-needed support for those who need it immediately. We've also have some amendments to the Act unrelated to employment leaves. Section 6-82 is being amended to enable a health sector employer to also be the designated employer's organization. This is precipitated by the creation of the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of this bill. Thank you.
It has been moved that Bill number 153 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to give our initial comments around Bill 153, the Saskatchewan Employment Leaves Amendment Act 2018. And as the Minister alluded to, there's a number of changes to leave being allowed from the workplace, Mr. Speaker. And it is something that a number of my colleagues have worked on for a number of years. And certainly they understand that some of the pressures as we deal with day-to-day challenges impact all people, and certainly those that are holding down full-time jobs. This is something that obviously that would be of a huge interest to them as well, Mr. Speaker. So as we look at the economy, we look at the balance between home life and certainly the balancing children's needs, and you can see many parents start work early in the morning, and then they go late at night, and you look at some of the challenges that many working people have as they attempt to balance their work life and of course their home life, Mr. Speaker. And as you look at some of the provisions around the Saskatchewan Employment Act, the act that is being discussed, 153 here, it talks about a number of initiatives that would basically recognize those challenges. And it's something on this side of the House that we've spoken about at great length. There's been a lot of work, a lot of discussion, and we we had a lot of general meetings amongst ourselves on how we could strengthen this particular aspect of trying to balance that home life, and of course the challenges and effort needed to hold down a full-time job as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I look at some of the challenges around taking care of critically ill adult people in our lives. I see a lot of people back in my particular community that have taken leave from their job to take care of their parents. And one of the challenges that I see is that we don't have enough facilities available to look after the elders that come into our community from other communities to have their critically, well, actually I shouldn't say critically ill, but certainly some of the other challenges, whether it be the onset of Alzheimer's or some of the other health challenges of the mom and dad because of the age factor. We're finding a lot of gaps in the care for our elders in some of our northern communities. And as you look at some of the examples of the children of these critically ill adults, that they really come through. They oftentimes on weekends and on evenings, they generally take care of their critically ill parents or their aunt or their uncle or whomever their family member is. And I really admire that because certainly from our perspective, we do that as a family. We see other families do this. And this is really something that is always, some say it's expected, but really, Mr. Speaker, a lot of families do this on their own, out of their own love and will for their loved ones. And it's nice to be able to see that some of these suggestions being proposed in this particular act are finally being heard by the Saskatchewan Party as we echo the sentiment that there has to be recognition of the role of people that are holding down full-time jobs and some of their additional roles besides their volunteer work in the community or raising children, being in a number of committees and boards and so on and so forth, that there's a lot of stress on the people that are holding our province together, holding our families together, and of course holding our towns, villages and RMs together, as well as the cities. So, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about recognition that many people that are involved in this wide variety of community activity and looking after their kids and holding a full-time job, what happens if they have additional pressures placed on them? Does that mean that they have to give up their job? From our perspective in the opposition, we have long maintained and we have steadfastly fought the argument that there has to be recognition of those challenges. And this particular bill certainly does part of that, Mr. Speaker. We want to, again, look at some of the opportunities involved with this bill. Extends maternity leave from 18 to 19 weeks, extends from 12 weeks to 13 weeks the time period allowed for maternity leave prior to the estimated date of birth. Obviously, that's certainly self-explanatory. Extends adoption leave from 18 to 19 weeks. Expands the maximum combined maternity and parental leave from 34 weeks to 59 weeks. Extends the maximum parental leave from 37 weeks to 63 weeks. Extends from 12 weeks to 13 weeks the time allowed for parental leave prior to the estimated date of birth. Mr. Speaker, this list goes on as to some of the areas in which we as the opposition work very hard to put into the act itself, again recognizing that many families, many communities, many people have an incredible challenge of balancing not only their home life but their work life and the additional strain put on them if there's a critically ill child or if there's a critically ill parent in their lives or people that are connected to their family. So it's really important that we look at the ways and means in which we can support these families and support these individuals. And Mr. Speaker, it is nice to be able to reach out to them and applaud them on their effort, but the bill has not been fully incorporated some of the challenges around, for example, the teachers in our province. Does this act apply to them? And obviously, Mr. Speaker, the Saskatchewan Federation of Teachers have already indicated on their website that teachers will not automatically have the option to take advantage of this 18-month parental leave, and I quote, unless corresponding changes are made to the provincial labor laws, end quote. So what is this government's plan to address these concerns? And that's why it's important As you've indicated, the opposition has done their part to raise these issues, raise these concerns, and get the government to recognize that people that have these extra stressors in their life, that we should accommodate some of their issues, and to point out that extra stress, that it does matter to us as legislators in the province of Saskatchewan to recognize some of these additional strains and challenges that they may have and encounter in their lives. So, Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that we have to do all we can to protect the wage earners, the breadwinners, if you will, Mr. Speaker, because these folks have a lot of strain and stress on them already, and this simply recognizes that at times when they do have additional stresses, that we shall certainly do all we can to accommodate them. So, Mr. Speaker, again, as I've indicated time and time again, it's important to explain what the bill's about, to explain the positive impact on the people that we're trying to recognize as a result of some of our work on this file, but to also point out to the government the gaps and the misses that they may have in their legislation, because we all know the Saskatchewan Party loves to go to war with the working people, and it's our job as the opposition to make sure that we balance those interests as we embark on this process of enacting this bill. So I would point out, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot more work to be done on this bill, a lot more research, and we're asking those that are involved with this particular bill to come forward and give us advice if they so wish. And always, Mr. Speaker, advice is critically important to the opposition. It's always a matter of just simply making the connect with the opposition office, and we'll certainly hear some of the concerns. A lot of people are very, very aware of what's going on here, Mr. Speaker. We need their advice, we need their input, and I encourage them to contact us at their earliest convenience so we can get their perspective on this particular bill. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 153, the Saskatchewan Employment and Leaves Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it a pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Bill number 154, the Intestate Succession Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Intestate Succession Act 2018. When a person dies, the executor is responsible for ensuring the deceased estate is distributed according to their will. This can often cause tension among family members and be stressful for the executor, who is trying to follow through with the deceased's wishes. When a person dies without a will, it can create even more complicated situations with many competing interests. In this case, the administrator likely has no knowledge of the deceased's wishes respecting distribution of his or her estates. In Saskatchewan, intestate legislation has been in place for over 100 years to alleviate these tensions and address opposing interests by establishing a system for distribution of an estate where an individual dies without a will. Mr. Speaker, this bill will repeal and replace the Intestate Succession Act 1996 with a new act to incorporate recommendations made by the Law Reform Commission of Saskatchewan in its report titled Reform of the Intestate Succession Act 1996. That report was released in March of 2017. The Commission's report made several recommendations for amendments to update the Act to ensure that the distribution of estates passing outside a will is clear and easily followed. Mr. Speaker, the new Act will clarify when a spousal relationship has ended for the purpose of distribution of an estate and ensure former common-law spouses are treated the same as former married spouses. The revised spousal separation provision will maintain the prohibition of a spouse who is cohabiting with another person in a spousal relation from inheriting part of the estate. It will also add provisions that the surviving spouse will take no part in the deceased estate where at the date of the death of the spouses they have been living separate and apart for 2 years, have started family law proceedings against each other, or are parties to an agreement distributing family property. The Commission recommended, and the new Act will include a provision that the entire estate shall pass to the intestate spouse if all the children of the intestate are shared with the spouse. Especially where there are young children of the spousal relationship, this will ensure that the surviving spouse has access to all available funds for the continued care of any children. This will also mirror current drafting principles for wills, as in most wills, the entire estate passes to the deceased spouse. Mr. Speaker, the new Act will also adopt a parentalic model of distribution, replacing the existing next of kin model. If there is no spouse, children, or grandchildren of the intestate, the parentalic model involves exhausting the parental line by distributing to parents, siblings, nieces or nephews, or great-nieces or nephews. If there's no one in the parental line, the administrator would distribute the estate to the grandparents of the intestate or his or her descendants, namely aunts and uncles or first cousins of the intestate. Differences between the two models of distribution arise where potential inheritors become more remote. The parentalic model permits relatives with a closer common ancestor who are in most cases closer in age and relationship with the intestate to inherit before most distant familial lines. The new Act will also not carry forward current Sections 19, which has to do with open quote, legitimacy, close quote, of birth where a child was born within a marriage that was later found to be an invalid marriage. Whether a child is born inside or outside a marriage is no longer tied to inheritance, and this provision can now be removed from the Act. Mr. Speaker, the new Act will also remove the spousal preferential share amount to the regulations and eliminate the doctrine of advancement. The document provides that advances given to a child during the lifetime of the deceased may be deducted from the amounts to be distributed to that child from the estate. The doctrine covers only specific types of payments to children and was intended to make the decision of the estate fair. The Commission recommended that the doctrine be eliminated as it can create uncertainty surrounding which types of advancements should be considered as preventing a child from taking part of the estate. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to move second reading of the Intestate Succession Act 2018.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 154 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, it's my privilege to give the initial comments around Bill 154, the Intestate Succession Act 2018. Now, Mr. Speaker, just for the lay people like myself, certainly intestate is all about how we deal with people that may have not had a will and yet have since passed away, and how do you deal with that person's estate? There's a variety of laws that obviously come into effect, and before I get into the bill itself, what I typically do, Mr. Speaker, is when people come to talk to me about some of the challenges that they have as it pertains to drafting up a will, it is a fairly complex procedure. It's not something that is very easy to do. And obviously my advice, as always, to many people that do come to see me, is to seek legal advice. And so I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated time and time again. I'm merely a hockey player from the north. So I make absolutely certain that I explain to them that I have no legal background, no legal training. So one of the things that I often want to do is find some means or mechanism as an MLA to either direct the people to the right individual that could do these wills, obviously legally in binding, but more so affordable. And we find many of the older people don't have many assets, and they come to see me and they're not prepared to pay $2,500 or $3,500, whatever the case may be, as the cost for the will. I imagine the costs get greater as the will becomes more complicated. However, Mr. Speaker, there is a cost to these elders doing a will. So even though they know it is right to do a will, many of them cannot afford to do the will. And this is why I think a lot of times when they come to see me, I encourage them to get legal advice. And sometimes they just simply want me to write out a letter saying that in the event upon their death that they want this asset to go to this person and so on and so forth. And while it's not a will, Mr. Speaker, it does give some indication as to what the person intends to do. And we've done that on 3 or 4 occasions, all the while reminding people that we're not a lawyer, all the while reminding people that because I'm not a lawyer, that you don't have the protection that they would, that a lawyer from a different part of the estate could probably tear apart my letter that I've written on their behalf. So, Mr. Speaker, it's important that I explain that to them as well. But clearly, I think one of the things that I'll point out is that to preempt this particular bill from coming into effect, and to avoid the confusion, I think we need to find the means and mechanisms to encourage wills being done by many people in and around the province. And while I'm more specific to my constituency, Mr. Speaker, we find that a lot of the elders in our community do not have the financial resources to hire a lawyer to do a will. So is there some kind of workshop? Is there some kind of effort? Is there something that could be done to try and help them as best they can to put together a will? Because, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, doing up a letter or an indication of their interest on how they want their assets to be distributed upon their death, Mr. Speaker, it's a very emotional time. I've had to be very patient at the kitchen table with some of the elders as they think about their children and their grandchildren, and they begin to break down. It's a very tough emotional time for them, and as always, we're very patient. And there should be, and that's the point, Mr. Speaker, is that during this critical time that they have to decide these things, they're in a very vulnerable state. And I've seen it on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, and again I reiterate, I tell them I'm not a lawyer, but I could write down what you want, you could sign it, and you can keep it. And upon your death, then you can certainly have it become part of your intent following your death. So, Mr. Speaker, we try our very best to assist in that regard. And like I said, it's a very vulnerable time for many of them, and there's a lot of emotion and certainly a lot of thought on their part. But, Mr. Speaker, because it's not done by an accredited lawyer, Mr. Speaker, I fear sometimes that even a letter that they've signed on, that I've drafted up on their behalf, could have some weakness in its intent, and I always make sure I explain that first, Mr. Speaker. So that takes us to the initial comment that I have on this particular bill. It would be wiser to encourage the creation of wills, especially those that are underrepresented when you look at the whole notion of who's doing wills. And I'm assuming that in the north, many of the elders are probably a huge group that are not getting their wills done. And I would even take a hazardous guess, maybe 60–70% of our seniors in northern Saskatchewan, based on my experience, Mr. Speaker, are simply not getting a will done for a variety of reasons. But the number one reason, of course, is the cost factor. Many of them do not have the resources to do a will properly. So we need to reduce the need for this particular act by doing a series of promotion of developing wills for people that have not traditionally been involved with this activity. On the bill itself, Mr. Speaker, it just basically says that if an individual dies, leaving no descendants, and that the entirety of the estate goes to the spouse, and if the individual that dies leaving the spouse and descendants, the estate is distributed amongst the spouse and the descendants, Mr. Speaker. So the bill itself repeals the Intestate Succession Act 1996, and it updates a few definitions. And one particular definition that it's updated, it's removing the term issue to replace it with the term descendant. So, Mr. Speaker, there's obviously some legal upgrade of some of the language. We need to know what the effect and impact of that is. And, Mr. Speaker, it talks about the determination of a spouse's preferential share in case where the individual that passes away, they call that individual an intestate, left the spouse and one or more descendants who are not descendants of the spouse. Well, that, again, Mr. Speaker, is important to incorporate on how this bill is being presented. It sets out the terms of the distribution of the estate if an intestate dies, leaving no spouse or descendant or parents. It also sets out how degrees of relationship between an individual and the intestate should be determined. And that, of course, Mr. Speaker, is going to be a very interesting read, because obviously there's all kinds of people that get involved with our lives in general, and how do you recognize them through a simple fact that you didn't do a will and your estate's up in the air. And of course, many people are impacted by some of these estates, and then you get the claims and the counterclaims, and it becomes a very, very murky and often frustrating process. The bill itself sets out the terms of inheritance regarding posthumous births, Mr. Speaker. A good example of that is that if there's an individual and the couple are about to have a child and the father dies and the child is born several months later, Mr. Speaker, then obviously that child would have rights to the estate as well. Well, this bill incorporates that particular aspect as well, so posthumous births are part of the bill itself. It sets out terms of inheritance in the event of separation or divorce. It, of course, Mr. Speaker, includes a French version of the bill. So the bill itself has a lot of different moving parts to it. As I mentioned at the outset, my preferred choice is to encourage people, and as many people as we can, to get their wills done by a proper professional, in this case a lawyer, Mr. Speaker, and obviously it would be in their interest to be very thorough and legal on that front. Secondly, that in the event that they don't do a will, and then you end up with these particular bills coming into effect because you haven't done a will, then all of a sudden you may have a common law spouse, you may have children of the common law spouse, you may have separate children of your own. There could be posthumous birth of children as well, Mr. Speaker. So all these factors are incorporated in this bill. It's an incredibly challenging time for families after they lose a loved one. But what adds to the challenge, Mr. Speaker, if there's not a will being done, there's no clear rules, then obviously it just becomes a problem for the family in their journey of healing. So obviously this is a very important part of what we do within government. And we obviously are going to pay a lot attention to this particular files. As I mentioned before, I have colleagues that are trained in law, and they're much more advanced than I am, so they would have a lot more to add to this particular process. And on that note, we encourage people to participate in the process if they so wish. Give us advice if you have some very good, compelling advice, and we look forward to opening up the opportunity to hear those concerns and to also seek advice. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 154, the Intestate Succession Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 3, Bill number 155, the Legislation Act.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Legislation Act. Mr. Speaker, this legislation replaces the Interpretation Act 1995 with a modern new act that implements the Model Interpretation Act of the Uniform Law Conference of Canada and adopts the most recent drafting standards. Mr. Speaker, the Model Interpretation Act was approved by the Uniform Law Conference of Canada in 2015. The Model Act is a result of a comprehensive review of the various interpretation acts currently in place across Canada and other common law jurisdictions and reflects the most recent case law and drafting standards. Mr. Speaker, this new act will adopt the modern principle of statutory interpretation, which was adopted by the Supreme Court of Canada in the Rizzo and Rizzo-Shoes decision. This new act will also expand the rules around gender-specific references to confirm that those references include persons of any gender. Mr. Speaker, while the new act will adopt the Model Interpretation Act, it will retain several Saskatchewan-specific provisions, including the presumption that an enactment does not bind the Crown unless specifically provided for in the enactment. The Saskatchewan-specific provisions related to the appointment in terms of public officers are also being continued. Mr. Speaker, the new Act will also move the provisions of the Regulations Act 1995 and the Statutes and Regulations Revisions Act into the new combined Act. Mr. Speaker, the provisions of the Regulations Act 1995 will be carried forward to this new Act without many significant substantive changes. The authority to revise regulations will be expanded to support the correction and updating of multiple regulations at once, which will simplify the process of updating cross-references and correcting minor errors in legislation. Mr. Speaker, the provisions in the Statutes and Regulations Revision Act will also be carried forward without many significant changes. The revision powers will be expanded to confirm that the revision committee may revise and alter language to achieve a open quote clear style, which will provide flexibility when preparing revisions. Mr. Speaker, this new bilingual act will combine all of the revisions related to the drafting, interpretation, publication, and revision of Saskatchewan's laws into one modern, efficient, and accessible act. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of the Legislation Act.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 155 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, on Bill 155, the Legislation Act 2018, Mr. Speaker, I want to point out at the outset that this is an important legislation, that we need to review this particular act very carefully, because if there's any change brought to the previous legislation, then we ought to know what the effects are, what the impacts are, and how the shift of roles and responsibilities might occur as a result of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I would point out that the bill itself repeals the Interpretation Act 1995, the Regulations Act 1995, the Statutes and Regulation Revision Act, and these are fairly significant acts, Mr. Speaker. And what really concerns us is the fact that when we have the Saskatchewan Party looking at changing acts, and certainly as the Minister alluded to, it talks about procedures governing the enactment of laws, it talks about interpretation of the acts, appointments of public officers or persons who may act for a minister, management and control of a corporation, revision and consolidation of the acts and regulations of many other impacted parts of the legislation that governs many of the activities of government, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure what those changes are. And this is where the trust factor comes in. And certainly from the perspective of the opposition, we want to see exactly what is being intended with this particular bill. There are many other aspects of, as I mentioned, legislation that are going to be impacted. We need to find what they are. And we often tell people throughout Saskatchewan land that some of the things that we watch for with government is not so much the act they put in front of people, because many times they'll put an act that seems innocuous in many ways. However, where the devil in the detail is, Mr. Speaker, is how the rules and regulations of that particular act could really advance the Saskatchewan Party in many ways. And so we need to find where that connection is. So I'll tell the people, when you have legislation of this sort coming through the Assembly, it's really important that you pay attention to see what is being done. Always look under the process of rules and regulations of any act, Mr. Speaker, because again, that's where the detail is. And as we all know, when you have any kind of agreements or any kind of acts, the devil is always in the detail. So we have to make sure we look very carefully at what is being proposed and what changes are being enacted as a result of this particular act. Now, widely, when you look at the name of the actual bill itself, Bill 155, the Legislation Act, what part of the legislation are they impacting with this act? There's rules, regulations, there's processes, you could actually, as I mentioned before, you can appoint public officers to act on behalf of a minister, but the list goes on as to some of the changes that the minister alluded to. So we need to know why some of those changes are made, to what specific act of government, and what particular law of government. And Mr. Speaker, that's one of the reasons why you've got to keep focused on what legislation is coming forward from this government, more in particular from the minister himself, because we've seen evidence in the past, and I make reference again, Mr. Speaker, on the Elections Act, where they got 3 new MLAs, and certainly some of the things that they put in place that would prevent people from voting. This is a bill that I still find some very fundamental democratic problem with, Mr. Speaker, as you put more hurdles for people to cast their ballots. And this was the same minister that's proposing this legislation that proposed the Elections Amendment Act, in which we saw a lot of people could not vote as a result of the rules that he put in place. And Mr. Speaker, that's one of the reasons why, from the perspective of the government itself, the Saskatchewan Party, from this particular minister, there's not a lot of trust in terms of what is being proposed in these bills, and that's why it's important that we really examine what is being done. And obviously, Mr. Speaker, we would encourage people that watch the proceedings that if they have any particular issue with the Act itself, to please come forward and share information with us, because it is the people out there that are being impacted, and as they share their experience and voice their concerns, it makes our job easier as the opposition and holds the government to account better, and in the long run, that serves the people of Saskatchewan overall much more efficiently and certainly much more fairly. So on that note, I move that we adjourn Bill 155, the Legislation 2018 Act.
Members move to adjourn the debate. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 4, Bill number 156, the Legislation Act, Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Legislation Act, Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, this Act accompanies the Legislation Act and makes consequential amendments to a number of English-only acts. Mr. Speaker, 3 statutes are being repealed and replaced with 1 new bilingual statute: the Interpretation Act 1995, the Regulations Act 1995, and the Statutes and Regulations Revision Act will all be repealed and replaced by the Legislation Act. References to the titles of the old acts and several English-only statutes will be updated to reference the new title of the Legislation Act. Mr. Speaker, there is no change in substance to any of the acts that are being amended in this bill. A total of 18 acts will be amended to reflect the new act title and to make other housekeeping changes as required to adjust cross-references to the new bilingual act. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to move second reading of the Legislation Act Consequential Amendments Act 2018.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 156 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, it's my pleasure to stand in my place to provide initial comments of this particular bill. Now, Mr. Speaker, on the outset or at the front end of the bill itself, it just basically says the Legislation Act, Consequential Amendment Act 2018. And the title is short, and so is the summary of the bill. Now, Mr. Speaker, these consequential acts and attachments to other main priority bills are important to pay attention to as well. And as the Minister alluded to, this particular bill has an effect on a number of other particular acts throughout the province. So, again, you got to be very careful as to what you're actually passing and what is being presented in some of these bills. And I want to point out that this particular bill, Bill 156, the effect on the following departments is going to be part of the process of this particular bill. What's being impacted is the Aboriginal Court Workers Commission Act. What other areas being impacted? The Community Planning Profession Act, the Election Act, the Enforcement of Money Judgment Act, the Executive Government Administration Act, the Land Surveys Act, Mr. Speaker. The other notion is the Lobbyist Act. That's also being affected, Mr. Speaker. The preamble of the Métis Act is amended as well. The Municipal Financing Corporation is also being impacted by this, Mr. Speaker. The Planning and Development Act, Mr. Speaker, is also being impacted. The Provincial Court Act, the Provincial Health Authority, the Regulatory Modernization and Accountability Act, and the University of Regina Act. These are all the acts that are being impacted by this Consequential Amendment Act. And that's why it's important, Mr. Speaker, that you pay attention to some of the matters that these bills and some of the issues that these bills will make an impact as it pertains to the operation of our province. So I think it's really important that we explain that to the public in general, that these consequential acts are pretty important to pay attention to, as I indicated, but more so is to let the people of Saskatchewan know that even though at the outset the bill looks small in terms of number of pages, the impact could be great. The effect could be huge in the sense of how things are being delivered now throughout the province. So it is important to pay attention, Mr. Speaker. So we are going to do exactly that. As I mentioned, Bill 155 and 156 are connected, and there's legislation to make the French language accommodation that we must make and should make. And it's important to note that we also want to point out to people that their advice is necessary, their input, and certainly their ideas on how we can make this legislation more effective and certainly keep its intent pure and make sure that the objective is achieved in the sense of making sure that the service is there for the people that need it and that there's no ulterior motive on behalf of the Saskatchewan Party in trying to hide some of the things that they've been known to hide over time through bills of this sort. So again, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have a very close look at what the impacts of all these other acts are. There's obviously some minor changes to some of the core act, but there's a lot of acts being impacted by this particular bill. So we need to assess that, we need to judge that, keep the doors open for communication for any stakeholder that might have an interest, and obviously that's a long-standing order from the opposition perspective, because we want to do a good job in representing the people of Saskatchewan's interests, but more so protecting those people who are being impacted by this particular bill. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 156, an act making consequential amendments resulting from the enactment of the Legislation Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 142, the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor, as always, to, on this Monday, enter into debate on Bill number 142, an act respecting proceedings against the Crown and making consequential amendments to other acts. And it's been interesting to read some of the debate that's gone before us, because we really rely on our legal resources within caucus, and they've made some comments, and of course it's a very interesting piece of legislation before us, and as one of them alluded to, the historical claims of the fact that at one point there was in common law the inability to sue the Crown. It was just something that a commoner did not do. You weren't, you know, the rule of the Crown was almighty, and there was no point in trying to do so. And so here we have a refining of that process. And of course, it is an important process. It's one that we think everyone is equal before the law. No one is above the law. No one, and especially those who make the law. That there should be a recourse before the courts, because the courts are perceived to be fair and balanced and wise in their rulings. And I think, and particularly in Canada, we see this as a norm, and this is an important thing. But but the question remains: so what are the changes? And of course, the minister did talk about that the state-of-the-art legislation, the drafting was done, and that was all done to ensure that it was up to the current standards, and that is fair enough. That is something that we should ensure is the case. And so I just want to take a minute to review the minister's comments, and he did talk about the fact that it is now bilingual, and of course that is a very important issue here, that we have the legislation and as much legislation as possible being translated into French, and so that is bilingual, and so that's a new thing, a new modern bilingual act that reflects the most recent drafting standards, the minister says. So fair enough, that's a good thing, and we have seen, and we think about in the past the speeding tickets that were, I think, issued just outside of North Battleford towards Cochin that were challenged because they were not bilingual, and the person felt that his rights were not being respected, and in fact that went quite a ways through the court system. And if I believe, but I could be wrong, but that fact that person did win. He also talked about the new act will remove the option for jury trials and in proceedings against the Crown. Now, that's an interesting one, not one that we think of very much. And you know, what's the difference whether you go with before a jury or before a judge? And you know, he doesn't explain what are the positives of going through a jury system. And of course, the positive is that you're being heard by your peers, and the case you make would be understood on a common sense process, of course, within the limits of the law. Now, he does say, the minister refers to the reason, two reasons. One, that not many people have used the jury process, only once in the last 20 years, so that would be in the late 1990s. And so I'm not sure what the case was and what the process, why they didn't use juries, but he doesn't talk about the positives. And I would like to know what would have been the good reason. Why would somebody select a jury system if they could? Is it more cumbersome? Is it, you know, we always think on TV, we watch the process, particularly in the American system, of going through the jury selection process. In fact, we had quite a controversy here, Mr. Speaker, in the case surrounding Colton Boucher, in terms of, and we hope at some time to deal with the issue that came up in the news around health cards, where First Nations may be identified on their health card by the simple letter R, which we haven't really dealt with, and I think that's something we need to, Mr. Speaker. So if you're making notes about things to think about, that health card system that we have now currently has a major flaw in it, and this is something that was reported on CBC radio in the summer. But I digress here, Mr. Speaker. We had a situation where people felt that jury was not well balanced. In fact, there were issues with it, that we continue to hear concerns about. And in fact, even though that was a criminal court and not involving the Crown, but it still shows a major flaw. But I would like to know the pros and cons of why we use a jury system. He said the second reason why it would be better to not have a jury system, of course, or be tried by a judge only, is the judge has to give reasons for their decision. In fact, has to have a document so that if there is an appeal, you have something to go back to. And I think that's very important. And so now, I'm not, as my colleague from the North confessed, he's not a lawyer, neither am I. But I am, so I feel a little bit of like a fish out of water. Fine, so, and I'm not even a decent hockey player from the center of Saskatoon. But Mr. Speaker, I feel that there is some questions that would need to be answered, because as we streamline this, I think that there's often a thought about why is this? So you know, the ministers talked about the fact that we need to update these things, and I always get a little nervous when any of the ministers over there feel they need to update or modernize, because I worry that that's code for something else happening. And in fact, we will have lots of reasons for thinking about what is really behind all of this, And are there going to be unintended consequences? You know, one of the things we value so much in Western democracies are our strong judicial system and how they are kept separate, but the courts are very important. We see today that, in fact, this government's record with using the courts, in fact, going to the Supreme Court, is not that stellar. And in fact, I have to say that the one about the right to strike was a very interesting one, and the minister at the time assured us that they had done a lot of good work at this. But Mr. Speaker, you may be interested in this stat. That ruling about right to strike, in the 3 or 4 years since it's been that case has been ruled, has been used some 180 times in court cases across Canada. So Saskatchewan really contributed. In fact, I understand that the debate in the Senate this Saturday about the post office focused largely on that Supreme Court ruling, which was brought to you courtesy of Brad Wall and the folks over there. I'm not sure that was their intention to play such a pivotal role in the Senate debate, but in one way or other, they are going to be the center of attention here. And Mr. Speaker, these things do matter. They do matter because they kind of work their way up. And at the time, we told them that it was foolhardy, and had they done their work, that they really know what they were biting off. But they were driven ideologically by a worldview that people did not have a right to collective bargaining. And here we have a situation where, in fact, it is entrenched now in the court rulings as part of the Constitution, and it may not be what they thought they were doing, but be careful what you wish for. So in this case, I do wonder if they really understand the ramifications of their simple modernizing of this. So I just have to say that as someone who's been an observer, a keen observer of how the courts in this government in particular work, and that in fact sometimes their drive in their ideology gets them into trouble, gets Saskatchewan in trouble, it is something that you better be careful what you wish for, as I said, because there are issues here. But we do support the idea of modernization in terms of bilingual bills. That's a very good idea. Obviously, modernization of the drafting of the language is very, very important. But I'm just going to be interested in hearing what others in the judicial system have to say about this, because we have to be careful around individual rights and how they are treated by government, or as some might call it, by Big Brother. And if you can't have your day in court with Big Brother over there, then we better make sure that we understand what we're truly doing here. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I know many will want to get into debates on other topics here, and I would move adjournment of Bill number 142, an act respecting proceedings against the Crown and making consequential amendments to other acts. Thank you.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 143, the Proceedings Against the Crown Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very honored to be entering debate on Bill number 143, an act to make consequential amendments to certain acts resulting from the enactment of the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018. And of course, this really just focuses on amending some of the other legislation so that it all fits into line. The Correctional Services Act 2012 is Section 111 is being repealed, and Section 23(3)G of the Freedom of Information Protection Act is being repealed. Mr. Speaker, and of course then the proceedings, they're adding 2018, so not much change to the provisions listed in Schedule 1. So, Mr. Speaker, I won't go into my earlier comments about be careful what you wish for. That stands for 142, and all of that stands with 143, because I know many people want to get into the debate today. But with that, Mr. Speaker, we will listen intently for the questions and others to enter into this debate. But at this time, I would like to adjourn debate on Bill number 143, an act making consequential amendments to certain acts resulting from the enactment of the proceedings against the Crown Act 2018. I do so move.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As ever, glad to take my place in the Assembly and join debates, in this case on Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, this is an industry that does a lot of great work throughout the province and has a significant history of self-regulation and cooperation with the government, be it municipal, provincial, even federal in some circumstances, Mr. Speaker, and certainly does a good job of articulating and advocating on behalf of the issues important to the industry. And I know that for a fact, Mr. Speaker, having long been witness to the good work of the various levels of real estate associations, and certainly, Mr. Speaker, it's this legislation is in response to the industry, and again, Mr. Speaker, there's an evolution that is undertaken in various pieces of legislation, but in this particular case, it builds on the work of the Real Estate Act, which was enacted in 1995. Its hybrid model of regulation of realtors with the semi-autonomous Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission, in combination with the oversight of the Superintendent of Real Estate, an official with the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority of Saskatchewan. And again, the rationale was put forward by the Minister in his second reading speech that given the date of that legislation being enacted, it was time for an update and to see what they could do around efficiencies and streamlining, Mr. Speaker. And again, this would certainly seem to be the case here. We'll be looking to follow up with the industry and their representatives, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the measures contained in this updated edition of the Act. But Mr. Speaker, that will take some time, and we'll make sure that work of diligence is done in good, vigilant style, Mr. Speaker. I don't have much more to say on this bill at this time, Mr. Speaker, but I know that, again, we've got that work of consultation and due diligence to undertake. So with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018.
145.
I'm sorry. Item number 12, Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018. Mr. Vermette.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to enter into debate this afternoon with respect to Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018. Of course, this replaces a bill that was brought forward in 1985. Certainly, a lot of change does occur in 30 years. I've read the minister's comments that this bill is required to ensure flexibility for the types of care and options out there to ensure care for many vulnerable people within our community, and certainly that's important. It's important we get it right with a bill like this, Mr. Speaker, and sadly, all too often with the Sask Party government, we have witnessed a government that has been unwilling to do the good faith consultation that's needed with stakeholders to make sure that legislation that's brought forward is indeed an improvement. And when we look at a bill like this, we're talking about some of the very most vulnerable within society, those that are fleeing domestic violence, those that are in need as children of protection, those in need of residential care, Mr. Speaker. And so we owe it to them to make sure that the legislation that's been brought forward is as strong as it should be, as effective as it should be in meeting the needs of those people, Mr. Speaker. It's fair to say as well, I know the minister has identified that there's growing needs to respond to those in these urgent and often crisis circumstances. Mr. Speaker, we see that all of the time in our work, and it's important that we have the adequate and care for those people and children at a time when they need it, Mr. Speaker. It's also so critical, though, Mr. Speaker, that the root causes of so many of the challenges are addressed, Mr. Speaker, and that's where we see, sadly, this government really sitting on the sidelines, Mr. Speaker, not moving forward the meaningful action when it comes to a province-wide suicide strategy, Mr. Speaker, not fixing our broken mental health and addiction services that are leaving far too many, Mr. Speaker, without the services and supports. They need them when they need them most, Mr. Speaker, at times when minutes matter in the life of someone, Mr. Speaker. And there's real consequences to not ensuring support and services at those critical times in the life of a person, Mr. Speaker. And the costs are sadly tragic in far too many cases, Mr. Speaker, but have a real cost from a social perspective and from an economic perspective as well, Mr. Speaker. I noticed that the licensing requirement of government has been shifted from 1 year to 3 years with this legislative change, Mr. Speaker, and I would have questions for the minister on that front as well as with stakeholders to ensure that that's appropriate. Ultimately, when a child is in protection by the choice of government, Mr. Speaker, we owe it to them to make sure that government is ensuring their care. And so that means there needs to be rigorous oversight, Mr. Speaker, of the care. There needs to be oversight to ensure that there's accountability in place. Too often, Mr. Speaker, we hear of stories and circumstances where that hasn't been the case, and this is a very important place that for government to fulfill to the people of the province when they're responsible for the care of a child or a person, Mr. Speaker. I think we're witnessing real serious concerns of this nature right now in Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, and it's just critical that the types of care that are provided have accountability brought in, that children and their needs are put first, or those that are needing services are put first, Mr. Speaker, and that government understands that even though they might have another provider for that care, that government has the ultimate responsibility to ensure their safety and their care, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not sure that this Act goes far enough to ensure that level of oversight and that level of support with the important care providers across the province who are incredibly strained for resources as well, Mr. Speaker. Too often not funded by this government. Too often we hear of stories and real examples when it comes to shelters, for example, Mr. Speaker, where literally hundreds and hundreds of those needing shelter are turned away, Mr. Speaker. In some cases, thousands are turned away in 1 year, Mr. Speaker, and that fails everyone. That needs to be addressed. But as I say, Mr. Speaker, it's important we get this Act right. It's important that those care providers and that all in this sector, all stakeholders were involved in the drafting of this legislation. And we'll be certainly interacting with and consulting with stakeholders across the sector. We'd invite those involved in this very important work to engage. At this time, we'll be looking, as the official opposition, at every opportunity to strengthen this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, we've learned, as Saskatchewan people have, long ago to not trust the Sask Party government with legislative changes, Mr. Speaker. Too often it's done in a vacuum without an understanding of the impact on those that they're responsible to, Mr. Speaker. And of course, I'll push again, Mr. Speaker, it's critical that when we're looking at the circumstances that we are here, the most vulnerable within society, it's critical that we see a government step up to the plate to address those very serious root causes and broader systemic and social issues that exist. And it's past time that this government got off the sidelines and to work on moving forward a province-wide suicide strategy, Mr. Speaker. It's past time that they stepped up to work to fix our broken mental health and addictions services across our province, Mr. Speaker, leaving far too many that are suffering in despair and darkness or without the supports that they need. And it's past time, Mr. Speaker, that this government got to work on meaningful action around poverty, Mr. Speaker, leaving far too many children, far too many people across our province without the basics in life, Mr. Speaker, food. Another report that came out here recently puts a spotlight on the incredible crisis that is child poverty, child hunger, Mr. Speaker, within our province. And, you know, as a teacher before coming to this legislature, I've always known, Mr. Speaker, that it's those basics, the stability in a home, the basics in a fridge, the basic food in a fridge, the roof over one's head that has a major impact on one's ability to learn. If you don't have food in your belly, if you don't have a safe roof over your head, good luck when it comes to learning, Mr. Speaker. So there's all that important work. There's the important actions that we continue to call on this government on with respect to domestic violence, Mr. Speaker. There's just so many critical areas that require leadership and action within this province. Too many of these critical areas, the Sask Party government is sitting on the sidelines and not getting to work with the good people within our province. And the solutions, Mr. Speaker, are known to us, Mr. Speaker, so there's no excuse for a government not to be addressing these major issues that are costing many people their lives, costing many people basic security, Mr. Speaker. So with respect to Bill number 145, we'll continue to consult with stakeholders throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. We invite those involved in providing care to connect, those involved in those that have received care, those that have been in vulnerable circumstances with lived experiences to be a part of this important conversation, Mr. Speaker. I thank all of those people and organizations that are out there working day to day with incredibly tight resources, often insufficient resources, to working to meet the needs of people across our province, and we'll make sure that this legislation is strong enough. For example, Mr. Speaker, at a time where we need to ensure improved accountability and improved oversight for those that are the most vulnerable, Mr. Speaker, I question decisions like shifting from 1-year licensing to 3-year licensing, Mr. Speaker. At this point in time, though, I'll adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 145.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018, as Rancourt.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure this afternoon to rise and enter into debate on Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill was introduced by the minister going back to November the 13th, so I guess a couple of weeks ago in this Assembly, and she had a fairly lengthy explanation in her second reading comments. One of the things that the minister noted was that the most significant changes in this proposed legislation are in support of the government's Prairie Resilience Plan, Mr. Speaker, something that, of course, we have a lot of concerns or questions about, for sure, including around the targets and the timelines there, Mr. Speaker, and the adequacy of that particular document. She described it as a Made in Saskatchewan climate change strategy. Certainly that is something that we on this side of the House have been advocating for a very long time, that any measures that we undertake in this province take into account the very real situation of people in this province, from industry to environmentalists to, of course, the children of this province, and ensuring that what we do in the end is effective, is not disruptive, and is enforceable, and is something that we can get broad-based support of. So that is something very clearly that we have been in support of, despite characterizations perhaps to the contrary, Mr. Speaker. So I wanted to make sure that I got that clearly on the record, as have other members on this side. The minister also noted that the changes laid out within this bill will help or are intended to help the Ministry of Energy and Resources and the Ministry of the Environment move forward on the Prairie Resilience Strategy, including the development of regulations that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the flaring and venting of methane by 45% by 2025. Mr. Speaker, of course this comes at almost or past the decade mark of this government, and despite at various times producing documents and then shelving them, and having ministers stand up and then shelving the ministers and different things like that, we haven't seen a lot of progress here, and in fact emissions have continued to rise, and the public demand to take this issue seriously so that we move forward in a way that not only protects industry and the needs of our province, but also protects our land and our air, our water, and no less than the future of our planet. Here we stand yet again in 2018, thankfully in some ways contemplating some changes, but wondering, is this adequate, and is it is certainly very late in the game. I don't think I need to ask whether it's late or not, Mr. Speaker. The minister also noted that this was a results-based program that includes penalties on emission, those who exceed emissions by operators who fail to meet the emission reduction targets. Again, as we've been saying, targets are important, and not only to have those targets, but to have some mechanism of enforcement of those targets is also very important. So that is something that we have been in support of for a very long time on this side of the House. I know members such as my colleague from Newtana and many others, the current critic for the environment, have also reiterated those concerns in a very articulate way many times over the years. The proposed amendments also provide the basis for negotiation of an agreement with the Government of Canada. Mr. Speaker, again, this is 2018, and something we've been calling on this government for a very long time is to put forth a plan that meets the needs of the people of Saskatchewan. The government, as we've seen probably too frequently, Mr. Speaker, seem content to play the political messaging side of this argument, but not so much the getting down to the details and actually proposing alternatives. So thankful to see a little bit of that here, Mr. Speaker, but again, question the timing and just why we're seeing this so late in the game. I know that this government was cited in the most recent provincial auditor report as recently as this year. This is volume 1 that I'm reading from. There were a number of concerns as outlined in chapter 4 of that most recent auditor's report, citing concerns around the activities or non-activities of this government. I read from the audit conclusion, page 42 of the 2018 report, volume 1 of the provincial auditor. One of the audit conclusions was we concluded that for the 12-month period ended September 30th, 2017, the Ministry of Energy and Resources had, except in the following areas, for the most part, effective processes, which is important to regulate oil and gas in the pipeline industries, with some exceptions. The ministry needs to set expectations for documenting its key activities and regulating reported incidents. One thing that we did see in the key findings on the next page is a very sharp drop in the number of reported incidents. If that is indeed the case, that the incidents have been reduced, that is of course something that is desirable, Mr. Speaker. But if it's a case that the incidents simply aren't being reported, then that is something very different. Another concern that the auditor raised was the ministry's need to document its classification of risk of reported incidents and its expectation on the nature and timing of its involvement to regulate reported incidents. Mr. Speaker, I believe later on in this report the auditor found that there was a very big difference in terms of the field offices, how they reported incidents, and that was brought up as a concern. In the final audit conclusion on this page, page 42, the provincial auditor noted the need to consistently inform industry operators when it is satisfied that industry operators have resolved and reported incidents. So there was this level of limbo, for example. Of course, we all remember the 2016 Husky oil spill that caused a great deal of upheaval and expense in the province